Okay, it is 9 o'clock. Officially, we have commenced. Welcome to this webinar on cybersecurity risk management and welcome from Brisbane. It is 9 o'clock in Brisbane and it will be afternoon and evening wherever you are in the world. Like I said in the invitation, no longer than an hour. We're going through some slides. There's a chat box that we're going to use. There's some Q&A that we're going to go through. And that's basically the housekeeping, because we've already established that we can, you can hear me, you can see the slides, we're good to go. So today's program is cybersecurity, past, present, and future. We're going to talk about risk management and mainly the value of self-assessments. And when you signed up for this webinar, we asked a question in the invitation, and some of you have actually asked me a couple of questions. Some questions were on the history of cybersecurity. Some questions were on the practical application of cybersecurity risk management. So as you will see, I have incorporated some of that in the slides, and some of that I will leave for Q&A. The bonus, I have a bonus. So at the end of today's presentation, I'm going to ask you a question. And the person who is able to answer that question first is going to win a $100 US voucher that you can spend in the out of service store, just not for exams, but anything else, $100 for you. So pay attention. I'm going to ask you a question about today's presentation, and it will be the very last slide that we are going to share. It will be a bit of a practical thing, so get ready. There will be some polls. I need you to be engaged. Okay. And for those of you who know me, I am a very big proponent of lifelong learning. So I'm going to take you on a journey. And the journey for most of us is that we go from unconsciously incompetent to consciously incompetent, where you go like, oh, there's so much I don't know. Then you go through your whole training, education, and learning process. Then you become consciously competent. So you've learned new skills, you've learned new things, you've learned new theory, new knowledge, and then it becomes second nature. So that you become unconsciously competent. So I don't know where you are on the spectrum, but I am assuming that this journey will be somewhere in between unconsciously incompetent to consciously competent. So let's go on this journey. Cybersecurity is something that a lot of people talk about these days. And what we've done at the Art of Service, we've developed some proprietary software to read all the questions that are in our self-assessments. So all the standard criteria around cybersecurity, and that software just reads all the words, takes all the information out of the questions, and it basically cuts through all the consultancy fluff. You know, all those consultancy BS words? It just cuts through it. And these are the words that come out of that assessment, out of that analysis. So what is really important around cybersecurity, and irrespective of the type of technology you use, or irrespective of the type of cybersecurity we're talking about, the words that are important are, from the left-hand side, you have new and smart and why. So the why question is really important. Why do we do things? Why do we approach cybersecurity this way? Why should we do it now? Those types of questions. And in that same area, you see a lot of words around grid and water and utility and impact. So that was one of those understandings for me, that even though we tend to think of cybersecurity from an IT and a data point of view, because data is definitely in there as well, grid, utility, and water, like physical attacks or cyber attacks on physical plants, is actually really important, and that's what's happening all over the world at the moment. So those are important words. And then words like systems and standards and information. So we need to have systems and standards, and we need to manage information around cybersecurity. We need to manage the information we dissipate to people around cybersecurity. And then on the right-hand side, should. And of course, that's a word that's from quality management. So of course, standard criteria and assessment criteria will have the words should in there. So not necessarily would or could, but should. You should do this. You have to do this. You have to do this to prepare for cybersecurity. You have to prepare. You should approach it from this point of view. So for me, this was a really clear overview of what's really important in the world of cybersecurity, irrespective of technology. So that's my gift to you. So that came out of our software. Come on. So then the history, and this was a bit of an interesting one. You know, I always do a trend analysis, and I always go to Google Trends if I want to see what's going on with a particular subject. And even though cybersecurity has been slowly rising over the years, or the interest in cybersecurity, there was this one big peak in October 2009. And I actually looked it up. What happened in cybersecurity world in October 2009? And that was actually the month where President Obama announced that it was Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So hence the big peak in the interest in cybersecurity. It dropped off quite quickly after that, but it's still growing. And in our journey of cybersecurity, most of us tend to think about cybersecurity in the context of internet security. So you talk about, dark web, and you talk about internet attacks and denial of service attacks. It's all around internet security, but it's a lot broader. So we're talking about cyber warfare. That's where the utilities come in as well. You talk about computer security, mobile security, network security. So there's a lot more to it than meets the eye, and it's a lot wider subject, and it's a lot wider than what a lot of people think about. So as specialists in this area, or as IT professionals, it's up to us to educate people that cybersecurity is not just internet security. There's a lot more to it, and that awareness is really important in the general population. And then, of course, because we talk about security and security management, we have to talk about threats and vulnerabilities. And those of us that have gone through an IT service management style history or background, we know that in availability management and in information security management, we used to talk about threats and vulnerabilities a lot. So it's all about external threats, internal threats. So what's the stuff that can happen? What are the threats that can happen to us? But also, how likely is it going to happen? And the more prepared you are for certain threats, the less likely that threat will have a major impact. And that's why I put this picture of the two glacier mountaineering people in this slide. Like, a lot of things can happen in this scenario. So these people, there are a lot of threats, and they would have prepared for this walk or this hike. They would have prepared for that. They would have identified the threats. They would have identified their own vulnerabilities and prepared for that. So for us within the IT industry, and for us in relation to cybersecurity, it's really important that we identify the threats, that we name them, that we write them down, that we work through them. And what you don't measure, you can't manage. So at least have knowledge of what's going on. And then the type of threats, of course, is the attacks. There's technical failures and defects. But more importantly even is things like human error and organizational weakness and force majeure. And one of the things that always pops to mind for me in relation to human error is, that bomb alarm or the nuclear alarm that went off in Hawaii a couple of months ago. Like, was that a technical failure or was it human error? It's still a bit up in the air. We don't really know. So it's very, very important that we take that into consideration as well. And that's why we're not just thinking about threats and vulnerabilities from a technology point of view, from an internet point of view or a computer point of view, but it's beyond the technical failures, what are we using the systems for? What are we using the technology for? And how can human error, organizational weakness, and force majeure have an impact on our business? So I think from a, for me, from a cybersecurity point of view, don't just focus on the technology. Look at it from a bigger context and look at it from a bigger perspective. And then, of course, you will always look at it against standards and compliance. And these are the top three that most organizations we work with actually mention to us. So there's the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is from the US. And that framework, we're actually quite proud because that's a government organizational framework. And our cybersecurity self-assessment guide has been assessed by NIST, and they put it on their website as one of the resources, one of the their recommended or resources that they know of and that they have assessed as being worthy of being on their website. There's also ISO IEC 27001 that was originally created in 2005, and then in 2013 there was an update to that standard. So if you're using ISO IEC 27001 in your organization, just make sure you're using the 2013 version of that standard. And then for Australian people, there's a couple of local standards and guidelines. For example, the Australian Government Cyber Security Centre and the ASIC Cyber Resilience Health Check. So those are the two that jump out to us as standards and guidelines that are really good to use within your organization, just to map it against so that you know what you're doing within a compliance and standards point of view. But of course, there's many more, and there will be many more coming in the future. MIT Technology Review, they wrote about the cyber security threats to really worry about in 2018. And one of the things that stood out to me was that they said that one big target for ransomware attacks in 2018 will be cloud computing businesses. And I thought about that. I thought, why is it cloud computing businesses? Why not go for financial institutions, or why not go for health institutions? Because when you think about cyber security attacks or cyber attacks, it is often health-related data or financial-related data that is being leaked. So why not use those type of organizations as your prime targets for ransomware attack? But it makes sense, because where do all the organizations store their data? I mean, where do we store our data? That's all in cloud-based storage. So whether it's Dropbox or it's Amazon, the SSS storage, or Rackspace, or there's all sorts of cloud computing businesses that offer storage services. So that's where the data goes. So that's where the gold is for ransomware attacks. So if you want to read more about the 6 cyber threats to really worry about in 2018, just do a Google search for the MIT Technology Review article. It's really easy to read, and it's a bit of an eye-opener, and it's definitely ransomware attacks are on the up and up, and I don't think anybody has figured out how to break through that yet. So yeah, that's another one. And then, of course, talking about data, next week, the 25th of May, is a big day for Europe and for every organization that stores data about European citizens. When the well, that's a typo. GDPR, it's not GDRP, it's GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, comes into effect. So that is a data protection regulation for all European citizens. And it is all about personal data, or data that can be personalized. So it's not just email addresses, gender, race, ethnicity, that sort of stuff, but it's also IP addresses. If you use cookies or pixels on your website, and you store that data in order to analyze what the behavior is of those people, you need to comply to the GDPR regulations. So even though you are a company outside of Europe or the European Union, be it in the US, be it in Australia, you may still be subject to the GDPR regulation. So that is something else to do some research on if you haven't done so already. And I'm sure you've already done research on it, because every cloud-based service, again, because they store most of our data, every cloud-based service has been updating their terms of service, have been updating their privacy statements. But you still have a week, so you can still look at it in your own organization, what you need to do in order to be compliant. So then the big question, that's a really high level overview of cybersecurity in relation to compliancy and standards. And the big question is, are you ready? Are you ready for cybersecurity compliancy? Are you ready? Is your organization ready? Are you doing conscious stuff around cybersecurity, or is it just something that goes into all the other processes? So one of the things that a lot of organizations do is they perform a self-assessment, and that is something that is recommended at the start of every project, or maybe at the start of every year. Do an assessment, put a line in the sand, know where you are, because again, if you don't measure, you can't manage. So measure where you are, measure what you do, so that if you create an improvement project, or you're going to attack have a strategy of improvement, then at least you know where you're going and where you came from. So you have that improvement delta. Of course, I'm going to show you our self-assessment guide, because I don't have access to any other organization self-assessment guides. But the idea behind self-assessments is the same, irrespective of the product that you use. I just wanted to give you an idea of the value of doing a self-assessment. Which self-assessment it is doesn't really matter, as long as you perform a self-assessment that provides value to your company. So this self-assessment goes through 7 phases. So it goes from recognize to define, measure, analyze, improve, control, and sustain. So every participant, and usually we work with companies where it's up to 10 participants. So every participant answers the question to say, in my belief, the answer to this question is clearly defined. So it's a personal approach. It's a personal assessment. In my belief, I can answer this question. I believe that this question can be easily answered. It's clearly defined. I know that we know what we're doing. So let's have a look at the recognize. And this is where you guys come in, because I created a, oh, hang on. I just need to, there we are. I created a number of poll questions, so we get a bit of an idea of where you would be. See, if you were my organization, then where would we be in cybersecurity? So from a recognized point of view, be aware of the need for change. Recognize that there is an unfavorable variation, problem, or symptom. So the sample question would be, think about the people you identified for your cybersecurity risk management project and the project responsibilities you would assign to them. What kind of training do you think they would need to perform these responsibilities effectively? So again, you answer the question with, in my belief, the answer is clearly defined. So you should see a poll popping up on your screen now. So in your belief, can you clearly answer this question in your organization? Just click, I strongly disagree, like I have no idea. There's no clarity on the type of training that people need to do. Or you disagree, you're not sure, or you're neutral. Or do you agree that it's clearly defined where what kind of training people need to do? Or you strongly agree, like, I know what training they need to do, and I've seen the training manuals, and it's all part of our HR processes. We're all over it. So we have 40% of people have voted so far. So still waiting for the 100% of people. I told you it was going to be interactive. 80%, we're nearly there. I think there's a couple of people sitting on the fence. Okay, so this is really interesting. So 36% of people say disagree, and 36% of people say agree. It's in your belief, the answer to this question is clearly defined. Strongly disagree, 9% of people. Neutral, 27%. Let's see the difference between the answers. So then we go to the next phase. So we've moved on from, we recognize that there's a need for change. Now we're going to formulate the business problem. So we need to define the problem, the needs, and the objective. So how can the value of cybersecurity be defined? So let's see what comes out of this one. So how can the value of cybersecurity risk management be defined? Can you clearly answer this question? So in your belief, the answer to this question is clearly defined. Yeah, we're at 37% now, 50%. Last time we had 80% of people, so see how we go this time. So this is about the value of cybersecurity. So in your organization, do we talk about the value of cybersecurity? Is it defined in relation to the strategy of the organization? Is it defined in relation to our short, medium, and long-term goals? So for 33%, or plus 8% really, so for 41%, people disagree with this statement. Like within your organization, you cannot answer this question with, in my belief, it's clearly defined. So that's a starting point to talk about the value of cybersecurity risk management, to discuss it with your executive teams, to discuss it with your team managers, to include this into your strategic plans, to include this into your annual goals and objectives, to at least have this value available. So then the next phase is measure. So we've gone from, we recognize, we defined, now we start to gather the data. So we're measuring current performance and the evolution of the situation. So we're gathering data, we're measuring the current performance. So let me just find the question. The question is, are threats, vulnerabilities, likelihoods, and impacts used to determine the risk? And this is the specific risk for cybersecurity. So are threats, vulnerabilities, likelihoods, and impacts used to determine risk, cybersecurity risk? Or do we just put finger up in the air and, you know, we'll see, we see what happens? You know, which is a strategy. I'm not sure it's a good strategy, but right, where's excellent. So this one was a bit easier to answer for most people. 79% say, I agree. We use threats, vulnerabilities, likelihoods, and impacts to determine the risk. And then 7% said, I strongly agree. In my belief, this is clearly defined. I know exactly how we determine cybersecurity risks. So our next phase in the self-assessment would be analyze. So we've collected all the data. We started measuring the data. and now you analyze it. And that is part of your DKIW process. You know, you go from raw data to knowledge to information to wisdom. So we have the raw data, we collected it, we measured it. Now we turn that into information. So it's analyzing causes, assumptions, and hypotheses. So the question is, do governance and risk management processes address cybersecurity risks? So think about your governance and risk management processes in your organization. Do you specifically address cybersecurity risks? Is there a clause within your policies and procedures and processes? Or is it just a blanket statement that we talk about security risks and not necessarily specifically about cybersecurity risks? So we're getting really specific now because we're analyzing the data that we've been measuring. Yeah, so. Okay, I think everybody has put in their votes. And the results are that 43% of people agree, yes, we use cybersecurity risks as part of our governance and risk management processes. Isn't it interesting, though, that when we talked about the recognize and define parts of the self-assessment, it was a lot more fluffy. So from a strategy and an organizational context, we weren't too clear on how to answer this question. But now we get into the operational side of data collection, measurement, and analysis. We know a lot better how to answer this question. And in a lot more organizations, this is where cybersecurity actually comes to the service. Although we still have 36% of answers to say disagree or strongly disagree. So those are organizations where governance and risk management processes do not specifically address cybersecurity risks. So our next phase would be improve. So we've gone from measurement, analyzing, now we know where the improvement parts of the organization are in relation to cybersecurity. So every question we answer in relation to cybersecurity. So a self-assessment question would be, what do we see as the greatest challenges in improving cybersecurity practices across critical infrastructure? So what is the greatest challenge? And it's not really asking what it is, but can you clearly answer this question? Do you know what the greatest challenges are? Have you had cybersecurity risk management briefings on specific vulnerabilities in your infrastructure? Have you been talking to your third-party vendors about specific challenges in improving cybersecurity practices? So this goes, you know, it's all about improvement of the processes. Okay, we're at 70% now. All the other questions were around the 80% of people placing their votes. So we're still waiting for 1 or 2 people. Okay, let's do this. 85% agree. They can answer clearly exactly what we see in what you see in your organization as the greatest challenge in improving cybersecurity practices. Okay, and then we go to control, the next phase. So now that we know what we can control, we create practical solutions, and all those solutions are built to maintain the performance and the correct possible complications. So it's all about maintaining control while you implement your improvement processes. So the question you could ask at this point in time is, a vulnerability management plan is developed and implemented. Do we know if we have a vulnerability management plan? Can you answer that question? Do you know where it is? Do you know if it's developed, or do you know that it is implemented? Or if you don't even know what a vulnerability management plan is, then say, I strongly disagree. So this is where we go into controlling the improvement, controlling the processes around cyber security. Okay, still waiting for 2 people to put their votes in. Just pick one. And if you don't know which one to pick, pick neutral. Okay. So a vulnerability management plan is developed and implemented. The most answered response is disagree. I cannot answer this question clearly. In my belief, it is not clearly defined. I don't know where our vulnerability management plan is, and I don't know if it's implemented. So this is where you get into a more mature organization that has a plan, knows how to improve, knows how to implement. And then the final phase is sustain. So how do we sustain the benefits of our improvements? How do we sustain the benefits of specifically focusing on cybersecurity? So the type of question that you could ask is the cybersecurity policy reviewed or audited? So question 1 is, do we have a cybersecurity policy? And if we do, or when we do, is that policy reviewed or audited? So this is really about sustaining the benefits of your cybersecurity risk management processes. So it's not just a fluke, it's not a one-off, it's part of your standard operating procedures, it's part of doing business. I think this is a harder question to answer for most people. So in your belief, the answer to this question is clearly defined, yes or no? Okay. It's interesting that nobody picked neutral in this one. It's either, yep, I disagree, or I strongly disagree, or yes, I agree, or I strongly agree. So it's, did you notice a trend? Because I did. When we went through all these phases of the self-assessment process, so the original phases of recognize and define was a lot of disagree, not so much agree. So it wasn't as clear. The middle section, which is more the operational part of it, was a lot more clear for most people. Like the answers were a lot more towards agree and strongly agree. Now that we're at the end again of improvement, controlling and sustaining the improvement, and sustaining and embedding the processes in the organization, it moves back into strongly disagree or disagree. That means to me that it's a lot more difficult to implement these parts of the process. And it's also part of the maturity of your organization. So that just gives you an idea of the type of questions that you would answer during a self-assessment. And if you, this is an example of the results of a real organization, not that we're not real people, but an organization that went through this, and obviously I've deleted the names of the participants. So all these participants walked through all these questions. And even though there are 861 questions in total in the cybersecurity risk management self-assessment, you don't have to answer all of them. So if you go, and that happens in our example as well, you know, not everybody answered every question. If you have no clue how to answer this question, or you say, that is just not applicable to our company, it's not applicable to our organization, then don't answer the question. But it gives you a good overview of where you're standing in your cybersecurity journey. And in this organization, as you can see, and that happened here as well, in the, well, actually, no, it was the reverse of what happened in our scenario. In the recognized part, there was a lot of strongly agree. Whereas if you go into sustain, it moved into strongly disagree. So this organization was very heavily geared towards strategy and long-term planning, and not so much in the improving control and sustain part of the process. So these were at the beginning. This organization was at the beginning of their journey of implementing cybersecurity risk management processes. What rolls out of this assessment, or one of the outcomes of this assessment, is that you have this RACI matrix, RACI diagram. So for each of the 7 phases, you will have the top 3 questions with the biggest impact. So for this organization, it was in recognize, do we use IT personnel directly, use outsourcing, or use both approaches to address IT issues in relation to cybersecurity risk management. So that was one of the lowest scoring questions. So that will also be one of the, I really don't like the term low-hanging fruit, but it's the most obvious starting point for an improvement process. So that's the result of you going through the entire self-assessment. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what it would be like to go through a self-assessment for cybersecurity risk management. And obviously, I hope you've seen that these results coming from the assessment will give you a good overview of where your company is sitting, where that there is room for improvement, where there is engagement in the organization for improvement, because that's an important one as well. Because if everybody says, like, I'm neutral, I don't care, then it's really difficult to get a cybersecurity risk management improvement program happening in your organization, because you don't have that support, you don't have that engagement from the teams. So it's not just, I don't have all the graphs in this slide deck. This is the area responses across the entire process. You also have all the responses of each individual participant, so you know exactly where people are sitting. So if you're looking for instance, a vulnerability risk management report, then you pick the people that say, I'm clear, I totally agree, I know where the plan is. So you ask them, because there's a lot of people that have no clue where it is. So it's just easier to assign resources to your improvement program or project, because you know who answered the question with, it's my belief that I can clearly answer this question, and you use them as your informants, as your information providing people, or maybe as team members in the project. So what are we going to do next? So we have some Q&A, and as I said earlier, some people sending questions prior to today, so that was really easy for me, so thank you so much, because that gave me an opportunity to prepare. You also have your Q&A button on the top, or maybe it's on the bottom for you. So if you do have a question, pop that in the Q&A box. And then after that, there's one more thing I wanted to share with you, and then we have the winner of the $100 voucher. So the questions, and I do have it prepared on paper. The first question that came in was, what produces the best value? What produces the best value? And I love that question, because you don't want to do a self-assessment just for the sake of doing a self-assessment. It has to have value for your organization. And I'm hoping that now that we've gone through the process of the self-assessment, you see the value, you see the benefits of going through this process. And to me, the easiest way to show the value is through that RACI diagram and that overview of the top three questions in each of the phases that have the biggest impact on your organization. Cyril says, best value, find a supporter. Yeah, absolutely. That's the other benefit of doing the assessment. As I said, the results come in per process, but also per person. So if you have a person that scores really positively on the questions, you can use that person as a champion or a cheering squad for your assessment and for your subsequent projects that flow out of your assessment. So yeah, great addition. Okay, how often are risk assessments performed? Oh, no, you're not supposed to see that one yet. How often are risk assessments performed? Just like with any type of risk assessment or quality assessments, at least once a year, or when a major change is happening. So if you have done a major infrastructure upgrade, or you've changed to an outsourcing provider, or you've moved to a cloud computing provider, that's the point in time where I would actually do another assessment, because things may have changed, and it's important to be on the same page again. And so yeah, so that's what I would do. The other question that came in is, how can third parties improve risk assessments? I actually had to think about that for a while, because I wasn't sure which kind of third parties you were talking about. So a third party could be suppliers, vendors, your cloud computing provider. A third party to me can also be your standards or compliancy organizations, or an external auditor. So to me, to improve the risk assessment or the cybersecurity risk assessment as part of all this, it can be beneficial to have external people involved, have an external auditor or the internal auditor, because they have a different point of view. They have they just look at it from a different angle. So when you put your team together, and like I said, in this scenario, you can have a maximum of 10 people doing the self-assessment. It would be beneficial to have people from different sections of the company attending or participating in the assessment. And if you can have a vendor or a third-party supplier in there, even better. It's all about transparency, and it's all about everybody understanding where we're sitting in the process. So I love that question. So thank you for putting that in. Question from the group here: how big should the company be for this kind of assessments? I don't think there's a size requirement for getting value out of it. You would assume that if it's a smaller company with, say, like 10 to 20 people, most people would be on the same page. Having said that, that's an assumption, and I've been working with a lot of smaller companies where everybody thought they were on the same page, and they were not. So it's doing an assessment like this really brings out the differences in how people view certain parts of the process, or how people view cybersecurity. And like that, one of the first slides was, it's not just computer security, it's not just internet security, there's a lot more to it. So doing an assessment like this, you could use it as a communication starter or a conversation starter in a smaller organization. In a large organization, I would use people from different disciplines or different teams. So I hope that answered your question. Let's see if there's any more questions here. How are risk assessment and audit results communicated to executives? Because that was the other question that came in prior to today. So how are risk assessments and audit results communicated to executives? To me, if you don't have the buy-in from executives, it's really difficult to do a process like this. So you need to have that executive buy-in. that's why we started in that recognize and define. So recognize the need for change, define what that means in the context of your organization. That's where you involve your executives. At the end of the process, after you've done an assessment like this, you would brief your executive teams or your management teams. You would do a presentation. You would prepare a brief, and yeah, exactly. Feeding it into executive meetings and continual review processes. David, exactly. That's the point I was trying to make. So yeah, collate all your data, collate information, and present it in the context of the business, present it in the context of the strategy of the organization. So I hope that answered that question. Another question came in here. Do you think we could group smaller clients in one assessment, or should we always do this per client? My recommendation is to do it per client, purely because of the sensitivity and the confidentiality of data. We had a lot of discussion with this about, with customers about putting this in an online platform, or discussing it with other organizations, or collate information from different companies together. And we got a lot of pushback on that, especially when you talk about cybersecurity risk management. That is, in a lot of organizations, commercial and confidence, highly commercial type of situations. So if you can do it anonymously, and you want to collect information from different clients to give people sort of like a benchmark, be very, very careful that it is a private discussion, that it is 100% anonymous, and that you're not sharing information from one client with another client, because I think that could do a lot more damage than that is good for us. So any more questions? Looking at it. No. Okay. If you have any more questions after today, feel free to email me. All my data is on the last slide anyway. So, and you guys know how to reach out to me. So feel free to contact me. Feel free to talk to me. I'd love to get some follow-up from you guys. So what I wanted to do to you, and that's the one more thing. I've created a bonus package for you. If you want to try out the cybersecurity risk assessment for yourself, in your organization, or for your clients, if you are a consultant, I've actually bundled it together with information security management and business continuity management. So you get 3 of these self-assessment guides for the price of 1. So I thought that was a really, really cool bonus for you guys. $247 for the set. That's a really long URL, so I am going to copy that into an email, which you will get after today's webinar. I don't expect you guys to copy that by hand, because that's not happening. But yeah, no, that was my bonus, because I really wanted to make sure that if you want to do an assessment, that you have some data to go across the board with your business continuity and information security management, as well as cyber security risk management. So hope you enjoy that. And then the very last one, the last slide, is: when did President Obama announce Cybersecurity Awareness Month? Okay, go. First person to answer this question wins a $100 US voucher in the store. So you have your chat. Sam, bonus, got it. Sam Sokach, you're the very first one, October 2009. Congratulations, you won a $100 US voucher to spend in the store. So well done. Sweet. That's the end of my presentation. Hopefully you enjoyed that. You got something out of it. And as I said, contact me, email me, talk to me if you have any follow-up questions. And after today's session, I will email you all your link to that bonus, which I will show you again. to get the 3 assessment guides for $247 in a single set. So if there's any final thoughts, no, that's it. Then I am signing out. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you spending an hour with me, or 50 minutes. I tried to be a little bit earlier so you can go to your next meeting and you even have time to get a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. So yeah, so thank you, and I will talk to you next time.